Dear friends, please make sure to subscribe to our channel. It truly means a lot to us, and it helps you stay connected so you never lose track of our new stories and updates. Thank you for your support. It keeps this project alive. The streets of Chicago lay under a bitter February chill on the morning of February 14th, 1929. Snow crunched beneath boots, the cold air carrying whispers of city life, oblivious to the horror that was about to unfold. On North Clark Street, a modest brick garage stood unassuming, its grey walls and grimy windows concealing the deadly preparations inside. The Moran gang, 7 of them, gathered as they did most mornings, unaware that today, loyalty would be meaningless and trust fatal. George Bugs Moran paced the garage floor, his eyes scanning the small room cluttered with crates, cars, and weapons. Beside him stood Peter Gussenberg, his right-hand man, and 2 other loyal lieutenants. The conversation was light, routine. Nothing hinted at the carnage about to descend. Yet outside, a different kind of precision waited. For men, clad in perfect Chicago police uniforms, approached the garage silently. Their shoes made no sound against the snow-dusted pavement. Each carried a Thompson submachine gun beneath his coat. One led the group, exuding the calm authority of law enforcement, though his eyes were cold, calculating, predatory. These men were not police. They were killers, hired for a single purpose: annihilation. The first moments were deceptive. The uniformed men stepped into view, badges gleaming, guns hidden. One shouted, "Police! Hands where we can see them!" Inside, the Moran gang froze, confusion overtaking caution. They knew the police, respected them, feared them, but nothing prepared them for the betrayal that would unfold in the next few seconds. Then the first gunfire erupted. The lead imposter whipped a Thompson from under his coat, the staccato roar tearing through the morning air. Bullets shredded the air, ricocheted off concrete, tore through bodies. Peter Gussenberg fell first, a scream caught in his throat as the bullets tore his chest. He crumpled, blood splattering the cold floor. Moran barely had time to react. He dove behind a car, the wood and metal offering little protection against the hailstorm of rounds. His men tried to return fire, pulling pistols with shaking hands, firing blindly into the shadows. Screams, gunfire, the metallic tang of blood filled the room. Another killer appeared from the shadows near the rear of the garage, a second Thompson leveled, sweeping across the floor. Bullets found their marks in legs, torsos, heads. Cries of pain punctuated the deafening bursts of automatic fire. One by one, Moran's men fell, their bodies hitting the floor in a wet, final thud. Amid the chaos, Moran spotted an escape, a narrow alley behind the garage. He bolted, adrenaline fueling his sprint. Bullets chased him, some tearing through the brick wall beside him, spraying dust and shards. He ducked into the alley, heart hammering, lungs burning. Behind him, the carnage continued. 7 men were down, executed with chilling precision. Outside the garage, pedestrians froze, staring at the empty street, unaware that mere minutes ago, a slaughter had occurred inside the brick walls. The killers moved with the efficiency of predators, calmly checking their weapons, wiping fingerprints, ensuring no trace would be left. In mere minutes, they vanished into the network of Chicago streets, leaving only a scene of blood, bodies, and chaos behind. Inside, the stench of gunpowder and death clung to the air. Blood pooled beneath the lifeless forms of Peter Gussenberg, Frank Gussenberg, Adam Heyer, and others. Their eyes, wide with disbelief, reflected the final moments of life as the killers had moved with methodical cruelty, ensuring no one survived. Not a single warning. Not a single mercy. The massacre was over in less than 10 minutes. What remained was a tableau of horror. Bodies sprawled on the concrete, pistols discarded, a few spent cartridges scattered across the floor. The killers left nothing to chance, nothing to interpretation. It was pure, unrelenting brutality, a calculated strike that would echo in the annals of crime history forever. The police arrived minutes later, alerted by neighbors hearing gunfire. The scene they found was grotesque, almost cinematic in its horror. 7 bodies, lifeless, sprawled across the garage floor. The air was thick with smoke, the metallic tang of blood overwhelming. No witnesses, no suspects, just the aftermath of perfect, ruthless planning. Rumors spread quickly through the city. Whispers of who had ordered the massacre, who executed it, and why. Newspapers would later describe it as a war between rival gangs, a strategic strike by Al Capone against Moran's North Side gang. But in the immediate moments, the only certainty was death and the stark reminder that in Chicago, trust could be lethal, and power was enforced by bullets. Moran himself would survive, luck and chaos intertwining to save him. But his lieutenants, his trusted men, were gone. The killers, disguised as law enforcers, had executed their plan flawlessly. This ambush, precise, merciless, and terrifying, would mark the beginning of a bloody chapter in Chicago's criminal history, one that would forever associate Valentine's Day with terror, betrayal, and death. As night fell over the city, the streets returned to an uneasy calm. But in the minds of those who survived, and those who would read the newspapers in shock, the massacre would linger. Every alleyway, every shadow, every distant footstep became a reminder. In Chicago, loyalty could not protect you. Only death was certain, swift, and absolute. The silence that followed the massacre was heavier than any sound. Inside the garage, the air still hung thick with the metallic stench of blood and gunpowder. 7 men lay dead, their bodies twisted and broken, the remnants of a violent precision that had left no room for error. Outside, the snow continued to fall, indifferent to the carnage beneath it. Chicago, in its cold, relentless rhythm, carried on as if nothing had happened. But word would travel fast, and the city would soon feel the tremors of terror. George Bugs Moran stumbled into the alley, adrenaline and fear propelling him forward. His lungs burned, his legs shook, but the knowledge that his men were gone hit him harder than any bullet could. He knew the streets would never be the same. Every alley, every shadow, every passerby could be the next threat. The killers had vanished like ghosts, leaving behind a perfect crime scene, one that would haunt Moran for the rest of his life. Inside the garage, the killers worked efficiently, checking the floor and walls, ensuring no trace of their presence remained. The spent shell casings, discarded weapons, and blood-smeared walls told a story of chaos, but for the men who executed it, every movement had been choreographed with lethal precision. They were professionals, soldiers in a war without uniforms, and today they had claimed victory. The city's newspapers would later describe the scene in horrifying detail. 7 dead bodies, executed with submachine guns, blood everywhere, a garage transformed into a chamber of death in under 10 minutes. The headlines screamed of betrayal, of gang warfare, of an audacious attack that defied understanding. For the public, it was almost cinematic in its brutality, a spectacle of violence that would forever mark Valentine's Day in infamy. Authorities arrived slowly, first neighbors, then uniformed police, alerted by the muffled echoes of gunfire that had reached the surrounding streets. Their first glimpse of the garage left them stunned. Bodies lay sprawled across the floor, faces frozen in fear, eyes wide in final realization of the fate that had struck them. Shell casings littered the concrete, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air. There was no confusion, no struggle beyond the violence itself, only death and its unmistakable finality. George Moran, moving through alleys and side streets, realized the killers had planned for his survival. It was no mistake. They wanted him alive, to witness the outcome, to understand that this was a warning, a message from a power greater than any street gang. He forced himself to calm, to move quickly, and to think. The streets of Chicago were treacherous now, every shadow a potential assassin, every passerby a spy. Meanwhile, the gangsters who had carried out the attack disappeared into the labyrinth of Chicago streets, their uniforms discarded or carefully stowed. Each step taken with precision, their mission complete. No one had survived to identify them. No witnesses remained. In their wake, only whispers of fear would follow, spreading faster than the snow that continued to fall. Inside the garage, police officers documented the scene. They measured bullet holes, noted the positions of the bodies, recorded the weapons used. Yet, despite their meticulous work, they could not bring the dead back, nor could they capture the men responsible. The killers had executed their plan with military precision, leaving law enforcement powerless, frustrated, and humiliated. Word of the massacre spread quickly through Chicago's underworld. Al Capone's men, known for their ruthless efficiency, were immediately suspected. The North Side gang had been decimated, their power broken in a single, audacious strike. Fear rippled through the city. Anyone connected to Moran, anyone daring to oppose Capone, now understood that loyalty was meaningless, that life itself was fragile, and that death could come from any direction, at any time, without warning. The bodies of the slain men were removed and prepared for funerals, but even in death, the image of their slaughter haunted those who survived. The bloodstains on the concrete could not be cleaned away, the echo of gunfire could not be erased, and the horror of betrayal in blue uniforms would linger forever. Moran, meanwhile, began plotting his next moves. He knew survival was only temporary, that retaliation would be necessary, that the streets would demand vengeance. But before revenge could be exacted, the city needed to process the scale of what had happened. 7 men killed in a single, calculated ambush. It was unprecedented. Every street, every bar, every hidden corner whispered the story of the massacre. Fear became currency. The killers, safe in the shadows of the city, knew their work had succeeded. Their target had survived, but the message was clear. Chicago's criminal hierarchy had been reminded of its fragility. Power was enforced by bullets, precision, and terror. The massacre was more than a crime, it was a statement, a proof of control, a declaration of dominance. The city woke to a new reality. The Valentine's Day massacre had left Chicago reeling, streets buzzing with whispers of betrayal, fear, and death. 7 men of George Bugs Moran's gang lay dead, their lifeless bodies discovered in a garage on North Clark Street. The city had never seen violence executed with such cold precision, and already the underworld understood that a new balance of power was being enforced, with bullets, not words. Inside the offices of Al Capone, news of the massacre was met with calculated silence. Orders had been given weeks earlier, the plan orchestrated to the smallest detail. Every movement, every shot, every second had been accounted for. The killers had carried out their work flawlessly, leaving no traces, no errors. Now, the aftermath demanded a careful strategy to capitalize on the chaos. The North Side gang was crippled. Capone's dominance would be unchallenged, for the time being. George Moran, the sole survivor, moved like a hunted man. Every alleyway he passed, every shadow that shifted, reminded him of the massacre. His men were gone, and vengeance burned in his mind. But survival was paramount. He had to understand the full scope of what had happened, who had orchestrated it, and how he could respond. Every step he took was calculated, every contact was measured. Chicago's streets were no longer merely dangerous, they were lethal traps, and Moran knew it better than anyone. The killers, meanwhile, remained ghosts. Disguised in police uniforms, they had vanished into the labyrinthine streets, their mission complete. No one could trace their steps. The precision of their exit mirrored the precision of their attack. Professional, merciless, absolute. Their employer, Capone, understood that fear was as powerful as the bullets they had fired. The North Side gang would remember the massacre for years, and the city at large would feel the reverberations of such violence. In the days following the massacre, law enforcement scrambled to investigate. Officers examined the garage, photographed every angle, measured bullet trajectories, and collected the evidence left behind. Despite the meticulous work, no substantial leads emerged. The killers had planned every detail, from entry to exit, from identification to elimination, leaving law enforcement with nothing but dead men and a trail of questions. Public reaction was immediate and visceral. Newspapers printed the names and faces of the victims, each obituary a grim recounting of brutality. Citizens whispered in cafes and on street corners about the audacity of the act, the possibility that gang warfare could erupt on any block, in any neighborhood. Children were kept inside, mothers pulled shutters against a city that seemed suddenly unsafe, and men who had previously ignored the North Side gang now feared even casual association. Moran, understanding the psychological weight of the massacre, began assembling what remained of his network. He reached out cautiously, testing loyalties, measuring the fear and resolve of those still alive. Every ally was a potential target, every decision could result in death. Yet Moran was driven by the knowledge that only a precise, calculated response could restore his power. He did not move emotionally, he moved strategically. Meanwhile, Al Capone and his lieutenants observed the city's reaction with satisfaction. The massacre had sent a message that power could be enforced without hesitation, that rivals could be eliminated swiftly and decisively. The operation had been executed with military precision. Every witness had been neutralized, every trace carefully concealed, and the remaining North Side men now faced a chilling reality. Survival was uncertain, and retaliation was dangerous. In the following weeks, rumors circulated of attempted strikes against remaining North Side associates. Small, targeted attacks kept the tension high, reminding the city that Capone's reach was absolute. Moran's influence diminished rapidly, his resources were scattered, his men frightened. Every street became a potential ambush, every meeting a calculated risk. Fear was now a currency, and the Valentine's Day massacre had devalued loyalty to a lethal degree. Police officers, frustrated and under scrutiny, worked tirelessly to connect the dots. They interrogated witnesses, followed leads, and attempted to reconstruct the events of that fateful morning. Yet the killers had covered every step. Uniforms were discarded or hidden, shell casings meticulously collected, and all evidence pointing directly to Capone's men erased. Chicago law enforcement had a crime scene but no perpetrators, a horror but no justice. Within the underworld, alliances shifted. Former allies of Moran began to question their positions, weighing loyalty against survival. The city's criminal landscape had changed irrevocably. Capone's dominance was uncontested. Yet even in apparent triumph, the tension remained palpable. Every day carried the threat of retribution. Every encounter was fraught with potential violence. Moran, though weakened, refused to vanish entirely. From safe houses and hidden locations, he observed, planned, and waited. Each surviving member of his organization became a link in a network of surveillance and cautious maneuvering. Retribution would not come immediately, but it would come. Every assassination, every massacre, had consequences, and Moran understood the long game of vengeance in Chicago's bloody streets. The killers, meanwhile, continued their work in silence. Disguised in law enforcement, blending into the city's fabric, they ensured that Capone's message remained clear. Violence could be precise, ruthless, and public or invisible, hidden in plain sight. The Valentine's Day massacre was more than a crime. It was a demonstration of power, a statement that survival depended on awareness, speed, and the cold efficiency of those willing to kill without hesitation. In the weeks that followed, the city adjusted to a new normal. Fear permeated every corner. The North Side gang, once a dominant force, struggled to regain footing. Moran's shadow loomed, but it was a cautious, measured shadow. Every move he made was calculated, every ally evaluated. Meanwhile, Capone's organization solidified control, the city under a tenuous but firm grip enforced by terror and bullets. The Valentine's Day massacre remained in the minds of all who survived. Newspapers would recount it in detail, historians would analyze it for decades, but those who witnessed it firsthand, survivors, law enforcement, and criminals alike, would never forget the precision, the blood, the sheer brutality of that cold February morning. Each bullet had told a story, each body had served as a warning. Chicago had been forever changed. The weeks after the massacre were a tense haze of fear and suspicion. Chicago's streets had shifted overnight, the balance of power violently recalibrated by bullets and blood. George Bugs Moran's organization had been shattered, the majority of his trusted men dead, their bodies strewn across a garage on North Clark Street like grotesque evidence of ruthless efficiency. Survival for the remaining North Side members required constant vigilance, each movement measured, each encounter scrutinized. Moran moved through the city cautiously, his few surviving lieutenants following discreetly. Every alley, every side street, every gathering became a potential trap. He had learned from the massacre, one misstep, 1 second of hesitation, could mean death. And yet, even in the shadow of overwhelming loss, his mind worked tirelessly, calculating retribution, planning the eventual strike against those who had executed his men. Al Capone's influence expanded in tandem with the fear he instilled. The killers responsible for the massacre, disguised in police uniforms, had already demonstrated their lethal precision. Their presence was everywhere and nowhere, their identities invisible behind the masks of authority. Each North Side member who survived realized that Capone's reach extended far beyond the obvious. Enforcement was silent, pervasive, and deadly. Inside the remaining North Side network, paranoia festered. Meetings were held in hidden locations, whispered communications ensured secrecy, yet suspicion gnawed at every individual. Who could be trusted? Who might be a spy for Capone? Every handshake, every familiar face, carried the possibility of betrayal. The memory of the massacre haunted every corner, every conversation, every heartbeat. Moran's few allies began small, clandestine strikes against minor Capone-controlled operations. They were calculated, surgical, meant to send a message without exposing themselves to the same precision killing that had decimated their ranks. Explosions, sudden shootings, rapid disappearances, each act fueled the tension between the rival factions. Yet every retaliation reminded them of their fragility, the overwhelming power they faced. Capone, in contrast, maintained his strategy with cold efficiency. The massacre had been just the beginning. Surveillance networks, intimidation, and selective violence ensured control. Every North Side attempt at reprisal was met with countermeasures. Informants infiltrated hiding places, traps were set, and assassins lingered in plain sight, disguised as citizens, law enforcement, or street workers. Chicago had become a chessboard of death, and Capone moved his pieces with unerring precision. Inside the city's corridors of power, law enforcement was frustrated, overwhelmed, and humiliated. Officers combed through every lead, examined evidence, interrogated survivors. Yet the killers had left nothing tangible behind. Uniforms were either destroyed or hidden, fingerprints meticulously wiped, and every weapon accounted for. The city's authorities had a crime scene but no perpetrators, a tableau of murder that defied justice. In secret, Moran planned. He understood that revenge could not be impulsive. The massacre had taught him the importance of patience, precision, and intelligence. His remaining men scouted Capone's operations, tracking movements, mapping exits, and noting vulnerabilities. The goal was not chaos but targeted retribution, to weaken the enemy, recover honor, and reclaim power. Simultaneously, Capone's men reinforced their dominance through fear. Small attacks, public displays of brutality, and the elimination of even minor opposition reminded the city that defiance would not be tolerated. Rumors of further hits circulated, sending waves of panic through the North Side survivors. Every street corner became suspect, every gathering risky, and every ally potentially deadly. Moran's strategy relied on patience. He avoided direct confrontation initially, focusing instead on survival and intelligence gathering. Meetings were brief, locations changed frequently, and the smallest detail could mean life or death. Communication was coded, messages delivered through trusted couriers, each word carefully measured. The massacre had made one lesson painfully clear. One error, one moment of carelessness, would be fatal. As weeks turned into months, tension escalated. Each assassination attempt, each carefully executed strike, heightened the stakes. The city itself seemed to pulse with impending violence. Citizens whispered in fear, newspapers chronicled every act of criminal activity, and even those not directly involved felt the pressure of living under the shadow of Capone's dominance. Moran's few successes were small but meaningful. He struck at minor operations, sowed confusion, and reminded Capone's organization that the North Side survivors were still capable of action. Yet every act of defiance came at a cost. Retaliation was immediate, brutal, and exacting. The streets had become a battlefield, and every move required calculation, courage, and luck. Capone, meanwhile, maintained his image of untouchable authority. Every assassination, every act of intimidation, reinforced his dominance. Law enforcement remained unable to penetrate the veil of secrecy and violence that shielded his operations. The Valentine's Day massacre had demonstrated the lethal efficiency of his organization, and the continued enforcement of fear ensured that power remained unchallenged. By the end of the first year following the massacre, Chicago had been irrevocably altered. Moran remained a shadow of his former self, constantly on edge, calculating the next move. Capone's influence expanded, cemented by terror and reinforced by the legacy of the massacre. The blood spilled that February day continued to shape every decision, every action, every heartbeat in the city. The massacre was more than an event. It was a blueprint for power, a demonstration of the lethal consequences of defiance. Chicago's criminal world had learned a harsh lesson. Survival required cunning, obedience, and awareness, and even the most loyal men could fall in seconds. The streets were unforgiving, and the shadows carried memories of bullets, screams, and shattered lives that would never be forgotten. The months following the Valentine's Day massacre had transformed Chicago into a city on edge. Streets that had once thrived with commerce and casual movement now felt like battlefields. Every corner, alley, and gathering spot carried the threat of sudden violence. George "Bugs" Moran, though alive, remained a ghost of his former self. His organization had been decimated, his trusted men gone, and the city's criminal hierarchy had shifted in favor of Al Capone, whose reach extended through fear, intimidation, and deadly efficiency. Moran moved carefully through the city, accompanied only by a few survivors, each action deliberate and calculated. Every street became a potential trap, and every contact a risk. He could not act recklessly. One misstep would mean death. Survival demanded patience, observation, and precise planning. Yet beneath this caution burned the desire for retribution, a measured, targeted vengeance against those responsible for the massacre of his men. Capone, aware of Moran's survival, reinforced his network of control. The killers responsible for the massacre, disguised as law enforcement, continued to operate in the shadows. Surveillance, intimidation, and selective killings ensured that the North Side gang's remaining members understood the deadly consequences of opposition. Fear became the tool of dominance, and bullets became the language of power. Inside Moran's dwindling network, paranoia festered. Every new ally was scrutinized, every communication measured. Trust had been shattered, replaced by suspicion and fear. Even those who remained loyal understood that survival was fragile, fleeting, and entirely dependent on caution. Yet, despite these challenges, Moran began small operations, targeted strikes intended to test Capone's defenses, gauge the reach of his influence, and measure the city's shifting loyalties. The first attempts at retaliation were surgical. Moran's men attacked minor Capone-controlled operations, their strikes swift and calculated, meant to create confusion rather than provoke immediate counterattack. Explosions rocked back alleys, sudden gunfire erupted near warehouses, and anonymous threats were delivered to rival associates. These acts were enough to unsettle Capone's organization, though they were careful to avoid drawing full attention to the North Side survivors. Meanwhile, law enforcement struggled to maintain control. The massacre had embarrassed the police department, leaving officers frustrated, outmaneuvered, and humiliated. Investigators combed over evidence, traced movements, and interrogated witnesses, yet the killers had left no trace. Every uniform, every shell casing, every weapon had been meticulously managed, leaving authorities with a perfect crime scene but no perpetrator. The city's finest were left to watch, powerless, as Capone consolidated control and the remaining North Side members plotted cautious strikes. Capone's response to Moran's minor attacks was swift and brutal. Informants infiltrated North Side hideouts, assassins shadowed the movements of suspected survivors, and public displays of violence reminded the city that defiance carried deadly consequences. The balance of power had shifted irreversibly, and the Valentine's Day massacre had become a template for maintaining dominance. Precision, terror, and elimination of opposition. Within Moran's ranks, every surviving member understood that the margin for error was vanishingly small. Meetings were brief, conducted in secret, and locations constantly changed. Communications were coded, and no action was taken without careful planning. Moran had learned that even the slightest lapse could result in annihilation. The memory of the massacre haunted every decision, every move, every breath in the city's cold, snow-laden streets. Despite these constraints, Moran began to rebuild cautiously. Safe houses were established, loyal contacts consolidated, and intelligence gathered on Capone's network. Each minor success was a step toward revenge, a preparation for a larger strike that could shift the balance once more. Every target was chosen with care, every action intended to weaken, disorient, and challenge the enemy without exposing the North Side's remaining forces to annihilation. Capone, aware of the careful movements of Moran's network, tightened his grip. Surveillance increased, assassins were deployed to shadow movements, and misinformation was spread to confuse the enemy. Chicago streets were a chessboard of violence, each side making precise, lethal moves. Every minor attack was met with countermeasures, every step calculated to maintain dominance and enforce fear. The city itself had become a theater of tension. Citizens moved cautiously, wary of the slightest noise or shadow. Businesses conducted trade under the constant threat of violence. Law enforcement operated under the burden of frustration and fear, while the criminal underworld navigated a landscape defined by bullets, betrayal, and strategic precision. As months passed, Moran's network executed increasingly sophisticated strikes. Small, targeted attacks disrupted Capone-controlled operations, instilled doubt within the organization, and kept the North Side's presence alive. Yet each success came with the realization that survival required constant vigilance, and any miscalculation could result in the same swift, deadly punishment that had claimed his men months earlier. Capone, in turn, demonstrated the lethal consequences of defiance. The Valentine's Day massacre had been just the beginning. Continued enforcement, intimidation, and precision killings ensured that his dominance remained unchallenged. Moran's attempts at retaliation were noted, countered, and neutralized whenever possible, reinforcing the reality that power in Chicago was absolute, maintained through fear and death. Chicago simmered under a tense winter sky, its streets still heavy with the memory of the Valentine's Day massacre. The city's underworld had shifted violently, and George Bugs Moran's surviving forces were cautious, scattered, and wary. Their attempts at small strikes against Al Capone's operations had been noticed, calculated, and, in some cases, foiled. Capone, however, was patient, ruthless, and relentless. He was preparing a counterstrike that would remind the city and the North Side survivors why his power was absolute. The first warning came quietly. Moran's men noticed that their safe houses had been compromised. Supplies disappeared without explanation, trusted couriers vanished, and surveillance suggested someone was always watching. The killers responsible for the Valentine's Day massacre had not only survived, they had returned to enforce Capone's will. Their methods were subtle, insidious, and lethal. One night, Moran received word of an attack on a minor supply depot he had established in a hidden warehouse. Men entered silently under the cover of darkness, armed with submachine guns and pistols. Moran's lookouts spotted shadows at the windows but were ambushed when they attempted to raise the alarm. Bullets tore through wood and steel, striking Moran's few loyal men in seconds. The survivors tried to return fire, but the attackers were methodical, precise, and unyielding. Within minutes, 3 men were dead, another 2 wounded, and the depot was in flames. Capone's response was not limited to physical attacks. Intimidation, bribery, and infiltration ensured that even Moran's closest allies were unreliable. Every network, every contact, every potential source of information became suspect. Moran realized that Capone's counterstrike was comprehensive. It was not only about killing, it was about breaking morale, isolating survivors, and instilling terror. As Moran regrouped, he received intelligence that Capone's killers were lying in wait in multiple locations across the North Side's former territory. Every alley, every warehouse, and every street corner could conceal death. Moran's few remaining men moved cautiously, avoiding known streets, traveling in small groups, constantly scanning for threats. Even the simplest act of movement became an exercise in strategy and vigilance. The counterstrikes escalated over the following weeks. Moran's minor operations were disrupted, supplies seized, and men eliminated in sudden, calculated attacks. Explosions rocked warehouses at night, silent assassins struck couriers, and the network that Moran relied upon was slowly disintegrating. Each loss was a calculated message. Capone's reach was absolute, and no act of defiance would go unanswered. In one particularly devastating encounter, Moran attempted to intercept a shipment of weapons meant for his small operations. He and 5 men approached a warehouse on a backstreet, only to discover Capone's killers had anticipated the move. A hail of bullets erupted from hidden positions. Moran dove behind crates, narrowly avoiding death, while 3 of his men were cut down instantly. The survivors barely escaped, blooded and shaken, with the bitter realization that Capone knew their every move. The psychological toll was immense. Fear, mistrust, and exhaustion eroded morale. Moran, though alive, understood that his position was tenuous. Each surviving member of his network was on edge, aware that any mistake could result in execution. Capone's strategy combined terror with precision. The Valentine's Day massacre had been an overt statement, while the current counterstrikes were insidious, constant reminders that the North Side had been weakened and could be finished at any time. Law enforcement, already humiliated by the inability to prevent the massacre, was powerless to intervene. They documented incidents, attempted investigations, and interrogated witnesses, but the killer's efficiency left little to trace. Each attack was surgical, leaving minimal evidence, and ensuring that Capone's men could operate without fear of prosecution. The city's police were forced to watch as the balance of power tilted further in Capone's favor, frustration and impotence growing with each successive strike. Moran realized that retaliation would require meticulous planning. Hasty attacks were suicidal. He began coordinating with the few remaining allies he trusted, mapping Capone's operations, identifying weak points, and preparing for strikes that could shift the momentum. Every detail mattered. Timing, location, weaponry, escape routes, and the loyalty of every man involved. Even a single miscalculation could lead to annihilation. Capone, meanwhile, remained confident and calculating. The counterstrikes served their purpose, reinforcing dominance, isolating Moran, and demonstrating that rebellion was futile. Surveillance networks, assassins in disguise, and informants ensured that the North Side gang's actions were tracked and neutralized. Chicago's streets became a theater of intimidation, every move scrutinized, every potential threat methodically addressed. The city's residents felt the tension. Rumors of assassinations, disappearances, and violent confrontations circulated rapidly. Businesses operated under the threat of extortion or attack. Citizens moved cautiously, aware that the city's underworld had escalated to a level of violence that left no room for complacency. Even the most minor incident could spiral into bloodshed. Moran's attempts to strike back were deliberate. Small, targeted attacks against Capone's operations demonstrated that the Northside survivors were still capable, but they did not yet have the power to challenge the complete dominance of Capone's organization. The counterstrikes ensured that Moran's efforts were risky, costly, and psychologically taxing. The bitter wind of Chicago cut through alleys and streets, carrying with it the faint scent of blood and fear. George Bugs Moran moved cautiously, a ghost among the shadows, surveying what remained of his fractured network. Every surviving member of his gang had become a sentinel, a watcher, and a fighter in a city that had been irrevocably transformed by bullets, betrayal, and terror. The months since the Valentine's Day massacre had hardened Moran. He had seen his men fall one by one, witnessed the precision of Capone's killers, and survived attacks that had been meticulously planned to leave him exposed and isolated. The city streets had become a chessboard of death, every move fraught with peril, every shadow potentially concealing a bullet or a knife. Moran understood that survival alone was not enough. Revenge had to be calculated, precise, and lethal. His few remaining allies were briefed, their roles mapped, every contingency anticipated. Safe houses were reinforced, escape routes planned, and weapons caches stocked. Moran's mind worked like a machine, each thought focused on one objective: strike back at Capone with precision and send a message that the North Side was not finished. Intelligence gathering became the cornerstone of Moran's operations. Informants were planted in Capone's territories, messages intercepted, movements tracked. The Valentine's Day massacre had taught him that foresight was survival. Capone's forces could strike at any time, from any direction, and with lethal accuracy. Every patrol, every courier, every public display of power by Capone's men was meticulously recorded, analyzed, and used to plan the next steps. The city itself seemed to hold its breath. Rumors of impending strikes circulated through alleys and bars, whispered by men whose loyalty was fragile and whose lives were constantly at risk. Citizens sensed the tension, noticing sudden disappearances, whispered threats, and unexplained acts of violence. Chicago was on edge, the air thick with the memory of massacre and the promise of more blood to come. Moran's strategy involved careful strikes designed to weaken Capone's network before a major confrontation. Small attacks disrupted shipments, assassins targeted couriers, and minor warehouses were destroyed. Each success was a calculated step, a message that the North Side survivors were still a force to be reckoned with. But the counterstrikes by Capone's men ensured that every move was dangerous. Moran learned that patience and precision were more valuable than impulsive violence. One night, Moran's scouts reported unusual activity near a Capone-controlled warehouse. Men in uniforms, possibly disguised as law enforcement, patrolled the perimeter. Moran studied the reports, cross-referenced movements, and planned a strike that would minimize exposure while maximizing impact. The operation was mapped with military precision, every alley, stairwell, and exit considered. The tension within Moran's team was palpable. Fear had become a constant companion, sharpening senses and instincts. Every footstep, every shadow, every distant sound could indicate an ambush. Men moved silently, communicating with gestures and glances, aware that even a whispered word could be overheard and exploited. The Valentine's Day massacre had taught them that overconfidence was fatal, and they would not repeat past mistakes. Capone, aware of Moran's movements, intensified his surveillance and countermeasures. Informants moved through the city, reporting suspicious behavior, and assassins waited in concealed positions. Every North Side operation faced the possibility of immediate disruption. The psychological pressure was immense, and Moran knew that one misstep could undo months of preparation and planning. Despite the danger, Moran pressed forward. He coordinated small strikes that tested the enemy's readiness, gathered intelligence, and trained his men for the final confrontation. The city became a labyrinth of danger, with every building, alley, and street a potential battlefield. Moran's focus was unyielding. He would strike back, reclaim power, and make Capone pay for the deaths of his men. The tension reached its peak when Moran identified a critical supply route for Capone's operations. Disrupting it could cripple the organization, weaken morale, and create an opportunity for a larger offensive. Moran and his team planned meticulously, studying patrol patterns, timing shipments, and identifying every guard post. Every detail mattered. One mistake could lead to disaster. As the night of the planned operation approached, the city seemed to hold its breath. Moran's men moved into position, weapons ready, nerves taut, hearts pounding. Every shadow could conceal death, every step could trigger an ambush, and yet the plan moved forward with ruthless precision. The final strike, months in preparation, was about to unfold, and the streets of Chicago would once again be stained with blood. The city of Chicago shivered under a steel-gray sky, its streets heavy with tension and anticipation. George Bugs Moran's small cadre of surviving men had prepared for months, each operation meticulously planned, every movement calculated, every heartbeat synchronized to the rhythm of survival. The final confrontation had been in the making since the Valentine's Day Massacre, a long, bloody chess match where one wrong move meant death. Moran's intelligence had uncovered a critical weakness in Al Capone's operations, a central warehouse serving as a hub for weapons, money, and communications. The opportunity to strike decisively had arrived. Moran gathered his men under the cover of night, weapons checked, escape routes memorized, and roles assigned. The few remaining loyalists knew that this strike could either restore their power or wipe them from the streets forever. Capone's forces, however, had anticipated the possibility of retaliation. Informants reported unusual activity, and assassins lay in wait throughout the north side, prepared to execute swift, deadly strikes. The final confrontation would not be simple. It was a lethal trap disguised as opportunity. Moran approached the warehouse cautiously, flanked by two of his most trusted men. Every shadow, every flicker of movement, signaled potential danger. The city seemed to hold its breath, aware that violence was about to erupt once again. The assault began with silent precision. Moran's men breached the perimeter, neutralizing sentries before they could raise alarm. The element of surprise was their only advantage. Gunfire erupted in sudden bursts, echoing off brick walls as Capone's men scrambled to respond. The streets around the warehouse became a battlefield, a cacophony of bullets, shouts, and the metallic smell of blood. Inside, the confrontation escalated rapidly. Moran's men fought with desperation, knowing that failure meant certain death. Capone's assassins, disciplined and experienced, countered with ruthless efficiency. The warehouse became a maze of chaos, smoke, and death, every hallway a potential killing zone. Shots rang out in rapid succession, bodies fell, screams pierced the night, and blood pooled across the concrete floor. Moran moved through the carnage, executing with precision, marking each target, his mind focused entirely on survival and vengeance. His men fell around him, casualties of a meticulously orchestrated defense. Capone's men, though fewer than during the Valentine's Day Massacre, demonstrated lethal skill, turning each attack into a calculated trap. Hours passed in a blur of violence. The warehouse, once a hub of criminal operations, had become a chamber of death. Moran's forces inflicted damage, destroyed key supplies, and eliminated several of Capone's lieutenants. Yet every gain came at a staggering cost. Survivors emerged covered in blood, physically and psychologically scarred, but alive, a testament to sheer will and determination. Outside, the city's police and curious citizens began to notice the chaos, but intervention was impossible. The battle was confined to the criminal underworld, violent and secretive. The streets reverberated with gunfire and sirens, but the full scale of the confrontation remained hidden from most. In the aftermath, Moran's position remained precarious. The strike had achieved temporary gains, disrupted Capone's operations, and exacted revenge for months of terror. Yet the overwhelming power of Capone's organization was still intact. Moran and his surviving men retreated, battered, exhausted, but alive, knowing that the war was far from over. Capone, observing from his stronghold, analyzed the results. Losses had been sustained, but the message of dominance remained clear. The Valentine's Day Massacre had set the precedent. The counterstrikes, the assaults, and the recent confrontation only reinforced it. Chicago's criminal hierarchy had been tested and had survived. Though battered, the city's streets remained under Capone's iron grip. The city itself bore the scars. Blood had been spilled across alleys, warehouses, and streets. Fear had been etched into the consciousness of every citizen who had witnessed or heard of the carnage. Chicago was a city forever altered, its underworld marked by the echoes of bullets, screams, and shattered lives. Moran, in the weeks following the final confrontation, worked to stabilize his remaining network. Trust was rebuilt slowly, intelligence gathering resumed, and minor operations restarted. Yet the memory of the massacres, the counterstrikes, and the final battle lingered, a constant reminder that the price of survival was high and the margin for error minuscule. Capone's dominance continued, enforced through fear, violence, and strategic control. The Valentine's Day Massacre remained the defining moment, the blood-stained precedent of what could happen to anyone who opposed him. Moran had survived, but the city had changed. Chicago's streets were no longer simply dangerous, they were lethal stages for power, revenge, and death. The endgame had concluded, but the war for control, respect, and survival would echo through the city for years. Every decision, every move, every bullet fired in those months would shape the criminal underworld, and the memory of the massacre, the hunts, and the bloodshed would endure in the streets, in history, and in the minds of all who had witnessed the violence firsthand. The city had not recovered. Chicago's streets remained tense, haunted by the echoes of the Valentine's Day Massacre and the subsequent waves of violence. George "Bugs" Moran had survived the endgame, but at a staggering cost. His network was fractured, his loyal men few, and the memory of bloodshed burned in every corner of his mind. Moran's efforts to rebuild were cautious. Safe houses were reinforced, escape routes memorized, and communication lines secured. Every move was scrutinized, every ally was tested. He knew Capone would never forgive even the smallest act of defiance, and that every minor success could provoke a lethal counterstrike. The few strikes Moran could still attempt were surgical. Couriers were intercepted, warehouses sabotaged, and minor operations disrupted. Each attack was a reminder to Capone's network that the North Side was not entirely broken. Yet every success came with the constant awareness of lethal retaliation. Capone, meanwhile, consolidated power ruthlessly. He deployed new assassins, infiltrated networks, and spread fear through Chicago's underworld. Informants were everywhere, loyal only to him, and the city's remaining North Side members realized that defiance could be fatal at any time. Law enforcement, still reeling from the initial massacre, attempted to piece together patterns. Every attack, every assassination, every explosion was meticulously documented, but tangible evidence remained scarce. The killers had been careful, leaving no traces, and Capone's influence ensured that witnesses disappeared or were silenced. Chicago was a city governed by shadows, where bullets, not law, decided power. The psychological toll on Moran's survivors was immense. Fear and paranoia dominated their existence. Every alleyway, every meeting, every street corner could be a trap. The memory of massacre, counterstrikes, and endgame battles haunted their minds, shaping each action with caution and calculation. The city of Chicago had become a shadow of its former self, its streets scarred with the memory of bullets, betrayal, and blood. The Valentine's Day Massacre, the months of counterstrikes, and the violent endgame had rewritten the rules of power. George "Bugs" Moran, though alive, was a husk of the man who had once commanded the North Side Gang. His forces were few, wary, and disciplined, moving through the city like ghosts among the living, aware that death could come at any corner. Moran's small cadre had survived by cunning, patience, and ruthless calculation. Each minor operation, sabotaging Capone-controlled warehouses, intercepting couriers, and striking isolated targets, served as a reminder that he had not been fully defeated. Yet every action carried tremendous risk. Capone's eyes were everywhere. Assassins, informants, and spies ensured that no move went unnoticed. The few remaining North Side members moved like shadows, invisible yet lethal, haunted by the memory of massacre and counterstrikes. Capone's dominance was absolute. His empire, cemented by fear, bullets, and strategy, had weathered every act of defiance. The Valentine's Day Massacre had been his most blatant demonstration of power, but the months that followed, the careful counterstrikes, the intelligence networks, the elimination of threats, had solidified his rule. The streets understood the rules now. Survival demanded obedience, defiance invited death. The city itself bore the marks of this violent struggle. Empty warehouses, burnt-out cars, and scarred alleyways told the story of a war fought in plain sight yet hidden from law enforcement. Citizens moved cautiously, whispering rumors of killings and disappearances. Newspapers chronicled the events, their accounts filled with fear and fascination, etching the violence into the collective memory of the city. Chicago had been transformed into a stage for ruthless, relentless criminal enforcement. Moran, reflecting on the months of bloodshed, understood the futility of reclaiming full control. Capone's reach was too great, his influence too deep, and his willingness to kill without hesitation unmatched. Yet survival itself had become a form of resistance. Each day alive, each minor strike executed, each loyal member kept safe was a victory against overwhelming odds. The legacy of the Valentine's Day Massacre was clear. Power in Chicago was enforced through terror, bullets, and unflinching calculation. Moran had learned the harshest lessons. Patience, precision, and paranoia were essential, and even the smallest error could cost lives. Capone's empire thrived, his dominance unquestioned, and the city would remember the lessons of bloodshed for decades. As the final winter descended, Chicago held its breath once more. The streets, though quiet, retained the tension of violence waiting to erupt. Moran and his surviving men moved cautiously, shadows among shadows, survivors of a brutal war they could never forget. Capone's empire expanded, vigilant, ruthless, and omnipresent, a testament to the lethal efficiency of the Valentine's Day Massacre and the calculated brutality that followed. In the end, the war had no true victor, only survivors and victims. Chicago had been changed forever. The streets carried the memory of bullets, screams, and shattered lives. The criminal underworld understood one immutable truth. In this city, survival, power, and fear were inseparable, and the legacy of blood would endure for generations.